I am 77 years old. A little over 3 weeks ago, I was out in the garage trying to free a rusted bolt on the cutting blade of my old lawnmower. My grip on the wrench slipped, the metal gave way, and I dragged the back of my left hand violently across a jagged, exposed edge of the steel deck. It was a deep, ugly scrape, the kind of wound that at my age instantly fills you with a quiet, tired resignation. I knew exactly what was supposed to happen next. The skin of a man in his late 70s is notoriously thin, and the healing process is painfully, frustratingly slow. I fully expected that scrape to bleed stubbornly, to turn into a wide, dark purple bruise, to scab over heavily, and to remain a tender, highly visible mark on my hand for at least a month. I assumed it would leave a permanent, discolored scar, because that is simply the reality of inhabiting an aging body. But yesterday afternoon, as I was sitting in my leather reading chair holding a book, the afternoon sunlight caught the back of my hand. I stopped reading. I took my glasses off and looked incredibly closely at the skin. The wound was entirely gone. It was not just patched over with fragile scar tissue. It was completely regenerated. The skin was smooth, the color was entirely normal, and the deep damage had simply vanished. I sat there in the quiet of my study, tracing my thumb over the unbroken skin, thinking about a small glass jar filled with tiny, pitch-black seeds sitting on my kitchen counter, and realizing with absolute certainty that I had fundamentally altered the regenerative machinery of my own body. I am sharing this observation with you because I wish someone had pulled me aside and told me what I am about to tell you when I first started noticing my body slowing down. For the vast majority of my adult life, I accepted a very depressing, incredibly passive narrative about aging. I believed that as the calendar turned and the decades piled up, our bodies simply ran out of building materials. I watched my own father age back in Ohio. He was a physically robust, hard-working man, but after he crossed the threshold of 70, I noticed a distinct change in how he recovered from the world. Every minor bump, every scratch from working in the yard, every small winter cold seemed to take a permanent toll on him. I remember seeing a large, yellowing bruise on his forearm that seemed to sit there for 6 or 7 weeks, never really fading away. He used to look at his arms with a kind of quiet defeat and say that the machine was just running out of spare parts. I absorbed that belief entirely. I assumed that getting older meant sitting by and watching your body's innate ability to repair itself slowly drain away until there was nothing left to draw from. I thought we were all issued a finite amount of healing power at birth, and by the time we reached our retirement years, the bank account was simply empty. I carried that grim assumption well into my own 70s. I started noticing the exact same patterns in my own daily life. A pulled muscle in my lower back from a few hours of gardening would ache with a dull, throbbing heat for an entire season. A minor cut from shaving would take days to close properly, and even then the skin looked weak. But what worried me far more than the visible injuries on the surface was what I could not see happening in the dark. If my skin and my muscles were struggling this profoundly to repair basic everyday damage, what was happening to my liver? What was happening to my heart tissue, or the delicate lining of my blood vessels, or my lungs? I knew enough from my years in publishing to understand that aging is, at its core, the accumulation of unhealed microscopic damage. I went to my doctor for a routine checkup and I asked him point blank why healing becomes so impossibly slow as we get older. He gave me a very clinical, sympathetic smile and told me it was simply a matter of stem cell exhaustion. He said it in passing, as if he were describing the weather or the changing of the seasons, something you observe but have absolutely no power to change. That specific phrase, stem cell exhaustion, bothered me deeply. It stayed in my mind for weeks. I am not a doctor, and I have never worked in a laboratory, but I spent my career taking complex information and trying to find the underlying logic. I needed to understand what that phrase actually meant inside my own tissues. I started spending my early mornings sitting in my chair with a cup of tea, reading everything I could find about cellular regeneration and the biology of aging. I learned that stem cells are essentially the master repair crew of the human body. They are blank slates, carrying incredible potential. When you injure your hand, or when your liver is dealing with environmental toxins, or when your heart is under stress, your body sends out a desperate chemical distress signal. Your bone marrow, which acts as the headquarters, is supposed to release these stem cells into the bloodstream. They travel directly to the site of the damage, and they miraculously transform into exactly whatever type of cell is needed to fix the problem. They become new skin, new muscle fibers, new organ tissue. They are the literal fountain of youth running through our veins. But the textbooks and the literature I read all said the exact same devastating thing. As we age, the bone marrow gets tired. The stem cells go dormant. They stop responding to the distress signals. The master repair crew essentially goes on a permanent strike, and the daily damage begins to vastly outpace the healing. But what I found next during my reading was the part that truly terrified me, and the part that ultimately forced me to take action. While the good cells, the repair crew, go to sleep as we get older, there is another type of cell that wakes up and becomes incredibly aggressive. These are the rogue cells, the mutated, damaged cells that eventually cluster together to form the devastating diseases we are all terrified of getting as we age. I started reading about how these rogue cells manage to survive and thrive in an older body. I discovered that they are incredibly manipulative and greedy. Even while the rest of the body is struggling and failing to heal a simple scrape on the hand, these mutated cells have the terrifying ability to hijack the body's own infrastructure. They release their own chemical signals that trick the body into building brand new blood vessels directly into them. It is a biological process called angiogenesis. The body essentially builds a private, dedicated highway to feed these dangerous cells with a constant supply of oxygen and glucose, allowing them to grow, multiply, and solidify their presence in the dark, completely undetected. I sat in my study with my notebook scattered across the desk, feeling a profound sense of vulnerability. On one hand, my body was losing its fundamental ability to heal because my stem cells were going dormant and ignoring the calls for help. On the exact same hand, my body was perfectly willing to build brand new blood supply lines to feed microscopic, life-threatening threats. I felt like I was living in a house where the security system was broken. The repairmen had all quit their jobs, but the front doors were wide open, inviting anything dangerous to move in and set up camp. I decided in that moment that I did not want to just accept this. I did not want to wait for a terrifying diagnosis in a sterile clinic room or passively accept that my body was going to slowly crumble from unhealed damage. I wanted to know if there was a way to wake up the repair crew in my bone marrow and simultaneously shut down the private highways feeding the rogue cells. My daughter Rebecca has been a clinical nutritionist for years. She is the one who consistently forces me to look outside the conventional, often limited boxes I lived in for most of my life. She came over for dinner one Sunday evening, and while Eleanor was in the kitchen, I showed Rebecca my notes. I showed her the research I had compiled on stem cell exhaustion and tumor angiogenesis. I asked her, with genuine frustration, if we were simply doomed to this biological decline. She looked at my notebook, smiled gently in that way she does when she knows something I do not, and told me I was only looking at half the picture. She told me that while the pharmaceutical world was spending billions of dollars trying to synthesize complex chemical compounds to control these two specific mechanisms, the natural world had solved the problem thousands of years ago. She asked me if I had ever heard of the seed of blessing. I told her I had not. She took my pen and wrote 2 words down on the margin of my notebook: Nigella sativa, black cumin seed. I had seen black cumin seeds before. I had seen them sprinkled on top of flatbreads at certain Middle Eastern restaurants or sitting in the background of spice racks, but I had never once thought of them as anything more than a minor culinary decoration. The next morning, I took the botanical name she wrote down and started digging deeply into the cellular research surrounding this specific ancient seed. What I found completely dismantled my long-held belief that aging is an irreversible, one-way street of decline. I read through historical accounts showing this seed was found in the tombs of ancient kings, revered for centuries and used for almost every conceivable physical ailment. But I am an older man, and I am not easily swayed by ancient folklore or mystical claims. I needed to see the mechanics. I needed to know exactly what this seed was doing inside the dark machinery of the human body. I discovered that the true power of this forgotten seed comes from a very specific, incredibly concentrated compound locked tightly inside its dark, hard shell. The compound is called thymoquinone. As I read study after study about how thymoquinone interacts with human biology, I felt that rare, profound thrill of finding a missing puzzle piece. The research described thymoquinone as having a dual action that sounded almost too perfectly tailored to the exact fears I had been harboring. First, I read about what it does to the rogue cells. When this compound enters the bloodstream, it actively hunts down the specific chemical signals that those dangerous, mutated cells use to demand new blood vessels. It aggressively blocks the angiogenesis process. It essentially cuts off the supply lines. Without that dedicated blood flow, the rogue cells cannot access the glucose and oxygen they desperately need to multiply. They are starved out. They undergo a process called apoptosis, which is essentially programmed cellular suicide. The body clears them away like trash before they can ever gather enough strength to become a threat. But the second action of this tiny seed was what made me look down at my completely healed hand yesterday with such awe. I found detailed papers exploring how thymoquinone interacts directly with the bone marrow. It does not just passively protect the body from threats, it actively stimulates the dormant repair systems. I read that regular daily exposure to this compound acts like a loud, persistent alarm clock for exhausted stem cells. It forces the bone marrow to wake up and start producing and releasing fresh, potent stem cells into the bloodstream. The literature I reviewed indicated that it could multiply the proliferation of certain stem cells by incredible margins, essentially tripling the active repair crew available in the body. It was reversing the exact exhaustion my doctor had told me was an inevitable fact of life. It was giving an older body the rapid healing capacity of a much younger one. Before I tell you exactly how I prepare this seed every single morning, and the critical fundamental mistake most people make that completely destroys its benefits, I want to pause for a moment. Many of you who watch these videos regularly and find value in these conversations have not actually subscribed to the channel yet. If you feel that these observations resonate with you, and you want to keep exploring these truths together as we age, please take a second to check if you are subscribed. It helps us keep doing this, and it ensures we stay connected. Now, let me tell you about the reality of adding this protocol to your life, because execution is everything. When I first learned about the immense power of black cumin seed, I made the exact same mistake almost everyone makes when they try to adopt a natural remedy. I went to a local health food store, found a bag of the raw seeds on the bottom shelf, brought them home, and just swallowed a heaping spoonful of them with a glass of water. I did this every morning for a week, expecting to feel a profound difference. I felt absolutely nothing. I mentioned my disappointment to Rebecca during a phone call, and she let out a long sigh. She explained to me that the human digestive tract is simply not designed to break down the hard, incredibly resilient outer shell of these specific seeds. If you swallow them whole, they travel entirely through your digestive system completely intact, taking all of that miraculous thymoquinone right out the other side. You get absolutely zero benefit from them. You are just swallowing gravel. She also warned me strictly against the second most common mistake people make, which is buying pre-pressed black seed oil in clear glass bottles. Thymoquinone is an incredibly volatile compound. When it is extracted into an oil and exposed to light, heat, or oxygen sitting on a store shelf for months at a time, the active healing compounds degrade rapidly and go rancid. You end up swallowing a highly oxidized, inflammatory oil that does more harm to your cells than good. She told me that if I wanted the true, raw, biological power of the seed, I had to do the work myself, right before the moment I consumed it. I changed my approach completely, and it quickly became a non-negotiable part of my morning routine. I bought a small, inexpensive coffee grinder that I dedicated solely to this purpose. Every single morning after I have my coffee and before I eat any other food, I take exactly 1 teaspoon of raw, organic black cumin seeds. I put them into the grinder and pulse it for just a few seconds until the seeds are broken down into a coarse, dark, oily powder. The moment you take the lid off the grinder, the room fills with this sharp, pungent, almost peppery aroma. That smell is the volatile compounds being freshly released. Because the taste is incredibly strong, bitter, and astringent, I do not try to eat the dry powder plain. I take a small spoonful of raw, unfiltered honey, dip it directly into the freshly ground powder until the honey is completely coated in the black dust, and I eat it just like that. I let it sit in my mouth for a moment before I swallow it. It has a heavy, medicinal bite to it, a taste that wakes up the senses. But I have come to deeply love that taste. To me, it tastes like repair. It tastes like agency. By grinding the seeds fresh every single morning, I ensure that the thymoquinone enters my stomach completely intact, unoxidized, and fully available to be absorbed straight into my bloodstream. The raw honey acts as a natural carrier, helping to deliver the compounds deeply into the tissues without spiking my blood sugar aggressively. I do this every single day without fail. I do not skip weekends. I do not take a break when Eleanor and I travel to see the grandchildren. It has become as fundamental to my daily existence as breathing. It took about 2 full months of this daily habit before I started noticing the profound, undeniable shifts in my body. It was not a sudden, jittery burst of energy or a miraculous overnight cure of a specific ailment. It was the quiet, beautiful absence of lingering damage. The deep joint stiffness that used to plague my mornings and make getting out of bed a chore began to slowly quiet down. When I pushed myself too hard working in the yard, the recovery time was cut in half. And then came the violent scrape on my knuckles in the garage, the deep, ragged cut that should have marked my hand for a month, closing and vanishing with the speed of a teenager's skin. That was the undeniable physical proof that my internal environment had fundamentally changed. My bone marrow was no longer exhausted. My stem cells were awake, circulating, and doing the vital work I thought they had permanently abandoned decades ago. I look back at my father, quietly resigning himself to the slow, inevitable accumulation of unhealed damage, and I feel a deep, heavy sorrow. We have been conditioned by our culture to believe that aging is a process of passive surrender. We are taught to watch our bodies break down, to expect the fragility, and to accept it as the natural order of things. We are told to wait for the diseases to arrive and then hope for a pharmaceutical intervention. But we have vastly more control over our cellular destiny than we are ever led to believe. The tools for profound structural repair, the tools for starving out the microscopic things that threaten us and multiplying the things that heal us, are often sitting right in front of us, disguised as simple, forgotten foods in the back of the pantry. You do not have to accept that your body's best days of healing are permanently behind you. You do not have to live your later years as a fragile vessel, just waiting for the daily damage to eventually overwhelm the system. The body warns before it collects. Most people notice too late what had been warning them for years. I am telling you this because I wish someone had told me earlier. Aging well starts with what you stop ignoring. Some damage happens silently until one day it doesn't happen anymore. You do not need fear, you need attention.